Welcome, dear night wanderers and beautiful non-sleepers. I'm truly grateful that you found your way here tonight. Thank you for visiting my little corner of the night. It means more than you know. Whether you're here to relax, to escape your thoughts for a while, or simply because sleep won't come easily, you are always welcome here. I wish you peace, comfort, and gentle moments ahead. May this channel bring you calm, rest, and maybe even the sleep you've been searching for. Tonight, we begin with something a little darker, a journey back to a time before playgrounds, pediatricians, or the very concept of screen time. We're talking about the medieval world, a place where childhood wasn't a protected stage of life to be cherished. It was a brutal, high-stakes obstacle course where the prize for winning was simply getting to be an adult. Forget the romantic myth of simple, rustic innocence. The reality was a world without safety, without sentiment, and with absolutely no guarantee you'd see your next sunrise.
The medieval mindset, children as small adults. And to understand that reality, you first have to throw out our entire modern concept of what a child is. We see children as vulnerable beings to be nurtured, protected, and educated slowly into the world. The medieval mindset? Not so much. For them, childhood was less a state of being and more a state of becoming. And that process needed to happen fast. There was no modern concept of a protected, sentimental childhood. A child's value was predominantly economic. They were a pair of hands in a world run on manual labor. Another mouth to feed, yes, but ideally a future plowman, a future weaver, a future source of income for the family. Emotional value was a luxury few could afford to prioritize, and this was largely shaped by the cold, hard math of survival. With infant mortality rates staggering, we're talking 30, 40, even 50% of kids dying before they turned 5. Parental attachment was often a cautious, reserved thing. You didn't name a newborn for a week, because why get attached? This wasn't cruelty. It was a necessary emotional armor against a world of constant loss. This is why the transition from helpless infant to economic contributor was lightning fast. The moment you could walk, you had a job. Tossing scraps to the chickens, scaring birds from the fields, stirring the pot. You were a small adult in training. The concept of the age of reason was around 7 years old. That wasn't when you got your first video game console. It was the age you could be held legally responsible for your actions and were considered capable of understanding sin. You were, for all intents and purposes, a tiny, marginally competent person, expected to pull your weight in a world that had zero patience for weakness. Your childhood wasn't a time of play. It was a probationary period for life. Chapter 2. The first great hurdle, birth and infancy. And if you survived the gauntlet of simply being a tiny economic unit, congratulations. But first, you had to get here. And that was the first, and often the last, great hurdle. Your very entrance into the world was a life or death event for both you and your mother. A brutal lottery played without modern medicine, sanitation, or really any understanding of what was actually happening. Childbirth was the domain of midwives, women who worked with a mix of folk knowledge, herbal lore, and pure desperation. Their tools were limited, their understanding of hygiene non-existent by our standards. The concept of germs? Centuries away. So infection was a constant, lurking spectre. If the baby was positioned wrong, if the mother was too small, if there was hemorrhaging, there were no emergency C-sections. There was just prayer and tragic acceptance. The mortality rates for mothers were devastatingly high.
Because of this immediate danger, the first order of business wasn't a photo shoot. It was a race against the clock. Baptism. This wasn't just a religious ceremony. It was an emergency medical procedure for the soul. A child who died unbaptized was believed to be condemned to limbo, shut out from heaven. So the moment you were born, often before your mother was even properly cared for, the priority was getting the local priest to splash holy water on you and say the right words. Your soul's eternal fate was literally the first item on the agenda because your physical fate was so terrifyingly uncertain. And once you were deemed spiritually safe, for the moment, your physical comfort was the next thing to go. You were swaddled. And not a gentle, cozy swaddle. We're talking full-body immobilization. Your limbs were wrapped tightly against your body with long strips of linen, turning you into a tiny, screaming mummy. This was done for two reasons they believed were correct. First, to prevent you from flailing and somehow injuring your own soft, unformed body. And second, and perhaps more chillingly, for pure convenience. A swaddled baby is a portable baby. You could be hung on a peg on the wall like a little parcel, out of the way, while your mother returned to her back-breaking labor in the fields or the house. Your comfort was irrelevant. Your safety, as they understood it, was everything. And if your mother was an aristocratic lady or even a wealthy townswoman, you might not even get her. Wet nursing was common. The belief was that breastfeeding ruined a woman's figure and was beneath a lady of status. So you'd be handed off almost immediately to a poorer woman in the village to be fed. This meant separation, different care, and exposure to a whole new set of risks in a different household. Your first bond, the most fundamental biological connection, was often severed for the sake of social convention. From your very first breath, you learned the central lesson of medieval life. You were not the center of the universe. You were a potential asset, a spiritual responsibility, and above all, a problem to be managed. And the management was rarely gentle. Chapter 3. The Unseen Enemy. Disease and mortality rates. And if you cleared that first hurdle, if you survived the perilous journey of birth and the strict confines of swaddling, you then entered the real gauntlet. Your invisible, microscopic opponents were already waiting. Forget monsters under the bed. The real monsters were in the water, in the air, on every unwashed hand that touched you. This was a world where a simple case of the sniffles could be a death sentence, and the statistics were absolutely brutal. We're talking about a world where between 30 and 50% of all children died before they reached the age of 5. Let that number sink in. Look at any small group of medieval toddlers. Half of them are statistically doomed. They weren't taken by dramatic plagues or wars, not at first. They were picked off, one by what we now consider trivial inconveniences. A bout of diarrhea from contaminated water could lead to fatal dehydration in a matter of days. A respiratory infection could quickly escalate into pneumonia. Measles, smallpox, whooping cough. These were not childhood rites of passage. They were terminal diagnoses. And the helplessness was total. There was no germ theory. Doctors, if you could even get one, operated on the theory of the 4 humours, trying to balance your blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile through bleeding, purging, or prescribing weird concoctions. For a feverish child, their best medical advice might be to drain their already weakened body of its vital fluids. Your parents' arsenal was pitifully small. Herbal remedies passed down through generations, prayers and charms. They would try anything, from poultices to amulets, but against a bacterial infection or a virus, they were fighting a ghost with a stick. You can see this relentless culling in the parish records. These weren't just ledgers of faith, They were grim, bureaucratic scorecards of survival. The baptism register is often followed immediately by a tiny, heartbreaking burial entry for the same name, sometimes within the same week. The names John and Joan, Henry and Alice repeat over and over again as parents desperately reused the names of their dead children, hoping the next one would finally stick. This constant cyclical loss wasn't an anomaly. It was the background noise of an entire era, a trauma woven into the very fabric of daily life. The psychological impact of this is almost impossible for us to grasp. You grew up surrounded by tiny graves. Your own siblings would vanish from the shared bed, their absence a quiet, unspoken lesson in fragility. This constant proximity to death didn't necessarily breed callousness, but it did breed a profound and pragmatic acceptance. Grief was a constant companion, but so was the grim understanding that this was simply how the world worked. Your childhood wasn't a guarantee. It was a temporary, precarious state that you had to fight for every single day against an enemy you could never even see.
Chapter 4. Your diet. From pottage to hard bread. And if you managed to dodge the microscopic grim reapers of disease, your next great challenge was simply staying fueled. Forget picky eating. Forget chicken nuggets shaped like dinosaurs. Your diet as a medieval peasant child was a lesson in monotony, scarcity, and just enough calories to keep you working. Your life revolved around a single central culinary masterpiece: pottage. This wasn't a soup. It was a gloopy, ever-present stew that simmered in a cauldron over the hearth fire for days, sometimes weeks on end. You'd throw in whatever was available: oats, barley, peas, beans, a few sad-looking root vegetables pulled from the garden. If you were lucky, a chunk of bacon or some scraps of meat might find their way in on a feast day, but that was the exception, not the rule. This was your breakfast, lunch, and dinner, day after day, season after season. The flavor profile was existent. The nutritional value was just enough to prevent you from collapsing, and that's if things were good. Seasonal scarcity was a brutal fact of life. The period right before the harvest, when last year's grain stores were running dangerously low, was a time of genuine hunger. Your pottage got thinner, the portions smaller. The constant gnawing feeling in your stomach wasn't a sign you needed a snack. It was the background hum of your entire existence. Nutritional deficiencies were just a part of you. Your bones might be a little weaker, your growth a little stunted, your teeth already showing signs of decay from a diet heavy on coarse grains. A fresh orange? A glass of milk? These were the stuff of legends, tales told by traveling merchants from impossibly distant lands. And what did you wash this glorious feast down with? Water? Too dangerous. Rivers and wells were often contaminated with, well, with everything. Human waste, animal runoff, the general filth of a world without sanitation. The safer bet, believe it or not, was ale. Now, before you picture a toddler chugging a modern pint, this was small beer, a very low alcohol brew, but it was boiled during the brewing process, killing off the pathogens. So, from a frighteningly young age, you drank a weak, slightly alcoholic beverage because it was literally safer than water. Hydration came with a tiny buzz, a necessary compromise for survival. The centerpiece of any marginally prosperous household was bread. But this wasn't the soft, fluffy, pre-sliced loaf you're thinking of. This was dark, dense, coarse bread made from rye or barley. It was so hard that you'd often use a thick slice of it as a plate, a trencher, soaking up the juices from your pottage. And then, when the meal was done, you'd eat the now soggy bread plate. Or, if you were really poor, you'd give it to the dogs or the beggars at the door. Every single calorie was accounted for. There was no waste. There was no choice. You ate what was put in front of you, and you were grateful for it, because the alternative was a hunger that could very quickly turn fatal. Your diet wasn't about pleasure or nutrition. It was about subsistence. It was fuel for the small, tired body that had to get up at dawn and do it all over again tomorrow.
Chapter 5. The Urban Child's Plate. A slightly different menu. Now, if you weren't born into the endless cycle of pottage and hard bread in a rural village, if you were an urban child growing up in a bustling town or a fledgling city, your menu had a few more options. Slightly. We're not talking about a medieval food court, but the sheer density of people and markets did create a different food landscape. You had access to a bit more variety, or at least the illusion of it. Instead of everything coming from your family's plot of land, your food came from the market square. Your diet was still overwhelmingly based on carbohydrates. Bread was the absolute foundation of life, town or country. But now there might be different kinds of bread. A white wheat loaf for the wealthy, the standard dark rye for everyone else. You might see more fish, especially if you lived near a coast or a river, preserved in salt and sold in stinking piles. There could be a wider array of vegetables, cheeses from the surrounding countryside, and even, on a very good day, a piece of fruit. Street food was a real thing. You could buy a pie from a vendor, though you'd be wise not to ask too many questions about the filling. Pastries, pancakes, cooked meats on a stick. For a child with a few coins earned from running errands, this was the height of culinary excitement. It was also a potential source of scraps. A child living on the streets might survive on what they could scavenge or beg from market stalls at the end of the day. But this urban variety came with its own set of hidden dangers. The persistent threat of food adulteration was everywhere. Unscrupulous bakers might add chalk or sawdust to their flour to make it go further. Beer could be watered down. Milk was often spoiled and had to be used for cooking immediately. There was no FDA, no inspections, no real recourse if you got sick from something you ate. Your slightly more interesting dinner could just as easily be your last. So, while the urban child's plate might have had a little more colour on it, the underlying reality was the same. A diet of subsistence, dominated by bread and ale, where the primary goal was to fill your stomach with enough calories to work, and where every meal was a small gamble with your health. The menu was different, but the constant, low-grade anxiety about your next meal was a universal part of the medieval childhood experience. Chapter 6. Your bed. Shared space, shared everything. And after that thrilling culinary adventure, it was time for bed. But forget your memory foam mattress, your blackout curtains, your personal sanctuary. Your bed, if you were lucky enough to have a designated sleeping spot, was a lesson in communal living taken to its absolute extreme. The concept of a child's bedroom, or even a child's bed, simply did not exist for the vast majority of people. Your home, as we discussed, was often a single room. And in that one room, the entire family slept. Mum, Dad, you, your siblings, maybe a grandparent or two. All together, often in one large bed, which was really just a wooden frame with a straw-filled sack thrown over it. If you were wealthier, you might have a separate bedstead, but you were still sharing the room with everyone. Privacy was a concept as foreign as a tropical vacation. And if you were a peasant, you weren't just sharing with your human family. Your bed was often in the same space as your livestock. The family cow, the pigs, the chickens. They were brought inside at night for warmth and security. So, you're trying to sleep, and a few feet away, a cow is chewing its cud, or a pig is rooting around. The smell was pervasive. A rich blend of animal dung, human sweat, and damp straw. Scented candles were 1,000 years in the future. And then there were the permanent bedfellows you didn't invite. Vermin. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, rats. They were not occasional visitors, they were residents. The straw in your mattress was a thriving ecosystem. You'd scratch your bites constantly. Lice were so common they were just considered a part of life, like having hair. There was no deep cleaning, no pest control. You just coexisted with your tiny, blood-sucking roommates. The complete absence of comfort or personal space was the norm. You slept in your day clothes, or maybe a simple shift, because it was cold and there were no pajamas. There was no such thing as my side of the bed. You slept where you fell, pressed against your siblings for warmth. The sounds of the night weren't crickets, they were the snores, coughs, and murmurs of your entire family, the rustling of animals, the scuttling of rats in the thatched roof above you. Sleep didn't come from a relaxing routine, it came from sheer, bone-deep exhaustion from a day of hard labor. Your bed wasn't a place of rest and recovery, it was just the place you collapsed until the sun rose and you had to get up and do it all over again. It was shared space, shared warmth, shared smells, and shared everything else, whether you wanted to share or not.
Chapter 7. Your clothes, hand-me-downs, and rough materials. And speaking of what you slept in, let's talk about what you wore all day. Forget soft cotton t-shirts and comfortable jeans. The medieval child's wardrobe was an exercise in pure practicality, where comfort was sacrificed entirely at the altar of durability and cost. Your clothes were not an expression of personality. They were a necessary and often irritating second skin. The fabrics were rough. We're talking about wool straight from the sheep, often scratchy and heavy, or linen made from flax, which was stiff and could be like wearing sandpaper until it was broken in by months of wear and sweat. There was no such thing as a soft, pre-washed fabric. Your clothes were stiff, they chafed, and they held on to smells and dirt in a way modern materials simply don't. That constant physical irritation against your young skin was just a fact of life you learned to ignore. And you rarely got anything new. Clothing was a significant household expense. Fabric was hand-spun and hand-woven, an incredibly labor-intensive process. So you wore hand-me-downs. You got the tunic your older brother outgrew, which he got from your cousin. It was patched, repaired, and recycled until the fabric literally disintegrated. A garment wasn't discarded because it was out of fashion, it was used until it could no longer perform its basic function of covering your body. You were a walking history of your family's wardrobe. Shoes were a particular luxury. Many peasant children, especially in the summer, went barefoot. If you had shoes, they were often simple leather bags for your feet tied with a thong. They were crude, they offered little support, and they wore out quickly on the rough, unpaved ground. In the winter, you might stuff them with straw for a little extra insulation against the cold. But for a large part of the year, your feet were tough, calloused, and permanently dirty from direct contact with the earth, the mud, and everything else you walked through. There were no specialized outfits. You had your one or two tunics, maybe a hood or a cap, and that was it. You worked in them, you played in them, you slept in them. They were patched at the elbows and knees constantly. The idea of play clothes versus school clothes
would have been an absurd fantasy. Your entire identity, sartorially speaking, was defined by practicality and poverty. Your clothes didn't keep you comfortable, they just barely kept you covered, marking you clearly as a small, economically marginal member of a world that had no time for your discomfort. Chapter 8. The soundscape of your life. Constant labor. And if the rough clothes against your skin were a constant, low-level irritation, the sounds that filled your ears from the moment you woke up were a constant, inescapable reminder of your purpose. There was no such thing as quiet. There was no leisure time to be filled with your own thoughts. The soundtrack of your childhood was the relentless noise of work. If you were a rural child, the sounds started before dawn. The crowing of the rooster wasn't a charming, rustic alarm clock. It was the signal that another 14-hour day of back-breaking labor was beginning. Your ears were filled with the rhythmic, metallic clank of tools being gathered, the lowing of cattle being driven out to pasture, the squeal of the wooden well pulley as someone drew water, the thud of the axe splitting wood for the fire. These weren't occasional noises, they were the permanent background hum of your existence from the time you were old enough to toddle. There was no distinction between the soundscape of work and the soundscape of life. They were one and the same. For an urban child, the noise was even more intense, a chaotic symphony of survival. You woke up to the clatter of carts on cobblestones, the shouts of street vendors hawking their wares, the constant hammering from a dozen different workshops, the blacksmith, the carpenter, the cobbler. Church bells marked the hours, but they didn't signal a break, they just organized the endless workday. The cries of animals being driven to market, the arguments from the street below, the sheer press of thousands of people living on top of each other, created a wall of sound that never, ever ceased. The concept of a controlled acoustic environment, a quiet place to read or think, or just be alone with your thoughts, was a fantasy. Silence was suspicious. Silence meant something was wrong, sickness, or worse. The normal state was a noisy, bustling, overwhelming cacophony of human and animal effort. Your ears were never given a rest. There was no music carefully chosen to soothe you, no white noise machine to block out the world. The world was the noise, and the noise was the relentless, grinding sound of labor. It was the sound of your value, your contribution, and your entire future, playing on a loop from sunrise to sunset, every single day of your childhood. Chapter 9. Your education. The school of hard knocks. And what about school? What about learning your ABCs, doing a little math, maybe getting a head start on life? Forget it. For the overwhelming majority of medieval children, formal education was an impossible fantasy, a privilege reserved for the tiniest sliver of the population, the sons of the very wealthy who were destined for the church. For you, education wasn't about reading and writing, it was about surviving. Your classroom was the field, the workshop, or the kitchen, and your lessons were taught with calloused hands, not chalkboards. There was no Department of Education, there was no universal schooling. Your learning happened through a process of brutal, practical osmosis. You learned by watching your parents and then imitating them until you got it right. A boy would follow his father, first just holding a tool, then being shown how to use it, then being expected to perform the task. A girl would shadow her mother, learning the endless cycle of cooking, cleaning, spinning, and childcare through direct, constant repetition. There were no instruction manuals. There was just the crushing weight of expectation that you would figure it out, because the family's survival depended on it. The only real path to anything resembling book learning was through the church. If you showed a glimmer of exceptional intelligence, and your family had the connections or could spare the lost labor, You might be sent to a monastery or a cathedral school. But this wasn't a given. This was a life choice, a commitment to a celibate religious life. You'd be learning Latin, scripture, and theology, not practical skills for the outside world. It was an education, yes, but it was also signing away your future for a life behind stone walls. For most kids, the real education system was apprenticeship. And this wasn't like a fun summer internship. This was a legally binding contract, often signed when you were just 7 years old, that magic age of reason. Your parents would essentially sign you over to a master craftsman for a term of 7 years or more. In exchange for your labor, and it was almost entirely labor, the master was supposed to provide food, shelter, clothing, and eventually, the secrets of his trade. You didn't get paid. You were paid in survival skills. Your childhood officially ended the day that contract was sealed. You left your family, moved into the master's household, and became his property in all but name. Your education was whatever menial task he put in front of you, from sweeping floors to stirring vats, with the vague, distant promise that one day, if you were obedient and lucky, you might learn something valuable. It was the school of hard knocks, and the lessons were often literally hard knocks.
Chapter 10. The Apprenticeship Contract. Sold for 7 years. And that apprenticeship contract? It wasn't a gentle agreement. It was a brutal, legally binding document that essentially sold you for 7 years of your life. Your parents or guardians would sit down with the master craftsman and sign an indenture. This wasn't a metaphor. The contract was often literally torn in two, with each party keeping a half, the indented edge, so they could be matched up later to prove its authenticity. Your childhood was being torn in half with it. The terms were stark. In exchange for your labor, the master provided basic sustenance, food, a place to sleep, usually a corner of the workshop or a shared attic, and simple clothing. That was it. You received no wages. Your payment was the eventual theoretical knowledge of a trade. But the master's rights were extensive. He had the legal authority to discipline you, and that discipline almost always meant corporal punishment. Laziness, mistakes, a bad attitude, all were met with the rod, the strap, or whatever tool was handy. Your body was not your own. It was an instrument to be tuned through pain. This system created a predictable problem: runaway apprentices. It was incredibly common. The reality of the situation, the harsh conditions, the demanding work, the often abusive masters, drove kids to desperate acts. They would flee, trying to get back home or disappear into another town. But if caught, the penalties were severe. They could be dragged back to the master, their term of service extended as punishment, or even publicly whipped. The law was squarely on the side of the master who had invested in this tiny, unpaid workforce. You were a financial asset, and running away was like theft. So you endured the years of menial tasks, the beatings, the loneliness, all for the distant hope that on the other side of this servitude you'd emerge as a journeyman, a free man with a skill. It was a gamble, and for many, the house always won. Chapter 11. Your playthings, sticks, stones, and imagination. So after a long day of work, what did you do for fun? What were your toys? The answer is almost heartbreakingly simple. Whatever you could find. The modern toy industry, with its aisles of brightly colored plastic, would be an incomprehensible alien landscape. Your playthings were the raw materials of the earth itself, and your imagination was the only factory. The scarcity of manufactured toys was absolute. There were no dolls with blinking eyes, no toy soldiers, no puzzles.
If you were incredibly lucky, your father might whittle a simple animal figure from a scrap of wood, or your mother might stitch a crude cloth doll stuffed with straw. But these were rare treasures. For the most part, your toys were sticks, stones, pebbles, and mud. A stick could be a sword, a horse, a cooking spoon. A pile of stones could be a castle, a flock of sheep, or just something to throw. Your imagination had to work overtime to transform the mundane into the magical. And this play wasn't a separate, supervised activity. It was woven into the fabric of your daily life. And the line between play and practice for adult tasks was incredibly thin. The games you played were often direct rehearsals for the life you were destined to lead. A boy playing with a miniature bow and arrow wasn't just having fun, he was practicing for hunting. A girl playing with a tiny clay pot wasn't just making mud pies, she was learning the basics of cookery. Even a simple ball game, kicking around an inflated pig's bladder, was developing coordination and strength that would be needed for labor. There was no such thing as playtime as a scheduled break. Play happened in the fleeting moments between chores, and it almost always served a double purpose. You played running games, tag, hide and seek among the cottages or in the fields. You played with knuckle bones, the ankle bones of sheep, which were used like dice for simple games of chance. You listened to stories and songs from the older members of the community, and you would act them out, becoming the heroes and villains of local legends. But it was all unsupervised, unstructured, and often dangerous. You played near open fires, near sharp tools, near animals that could kick or bite. There was no adult hovering nearby to make sure you were safe. Your safety was, once again, your own problem. Your childhood play was a brief, imaginative spark in a world of relentless practicality. A small space where you could, for a moment, pretend to be something other than a tiny, tired adult in training. Chapter 12. The Church's Shadow. Religious Instruction and Fear. And if the physical world wasn't frightening enough, there was an entire spiritual dimension of terror to navigate. Your entire mental landscape, your understanding of right and wrong, of safety and danger, was shaped and dominated by the church. This wasn't a gentle, abstract faith. It was a constant, looming presence that taught you through one primary tool: fear. From your earliest moments, you were taught that the world was a battlefield between God and the devil, and your immortal soul was the prize. Your religious instruction wasn't about finding inner peace. It was about learning the rules to avoid an eternity of damnation. You learned your catechism, the basic prayers and tenets of the faith, not through gentle encouragement, but through rote memorization and the very real threat of punishment if you got it wrong. This was your first mental programming, and the code was written in fire and brimstone. The stories you were told weren't gentle parables. They were the lives of the saints, which were often horrific tales of martyrdom, people being boiled alive, sawed in half, or devoured by lions for their faith. These were your heroes. And for every saint, there was a demon waiting in the shadows, a temptation around every corner. The concept of hell wasn't a metaphor. It was a vividly described, terrifyingly real place of eternal, physical torment that you were told awaited you for even the smallest sin. Your childhood was shadowed by this constant, low-grade anxiety about your own salvation. And the church's calendar didn't just mark the time, it structured your entire emotional year. The long, grim austerity of Lent, with its fasting and somber prayers, was followed by the temporary release of Easter. But even the feast days were framed by the ever-present reality of sin and death. The message was relentless. You are born in sin, you will likely die in sin, and your only hope is the fragile mercy of a terrifyingly judgmental God. Your imagination, the one place that might have been free,
was instead populated with demons, devils, and the agonies of the damned. There was no escape. The church didn't just own your Sundays, it owned your mind, and it leased it back to you with a high interest rate of pure, unadulterated fear.
Chapter 13. Your legal status. Property, not person. And if the spiritual world treated you as a sinful soul in need of correction, the earthly legal system saw you as something even simpler. Property. The modern idea of a child having inherent rights, a legal personality distinct from their parents, was a fantasy. In the eyes of the law, you were an asset, a small breathing piece of your father's estate, or, if you were an apprentice, the legal responsibility of your master. Your autonomy was zero. This wasn't a vague social custom, it was embedded in law. Your father held patria potestas, the power of the father over you. This gave him the right to direct your life, your labor, and even your marriage. He could consent to your apprenticeship contract, essentially leasing you out for years. He could discipline you with near absolute impunity. The law offered you very few protections against abuse, because the law saw your father's authority as the primary mechanism for your care and control. You were his to manage, for better, or, far too often, for worse. And the concept of childhood incapacity worked in a strange, contradictory way. The law recognized that you weren't a full adult, but instead of protecting you, this often left you more vulnerable. You couldn't own property. You couldn't enter into legal contracts on your own. You couldn't testify in court with the same weight as an adult. This legal invisibility meant that if you were wronged by someone other than your guardian, seeking justice was nearly impossible. You had no legal voice. Perhaps most shocking to our modern sensibilities was the age of criminal responsibility. It was terrifyingly young. The common law often set the age at 7. Yes, 7 years old. A child of 7 could, in theory, be held fully responsible for a crime, face imprisonment, or even capital punishment. In practice, courts were often reluctant to execute a child, but the fact that it was legally possible tells you everything about how childhood was viewed. You were expected to know right from wrong almost as soon as you could walk and talk. Your age wasn't an excuse, it was just a factor that might, if you were lucky, earn you a slightly lesser punishment. You were a small adult in the eyes of the law, burdened with the consequences but granted none of the privileges. Your legal status wasn't about safeguarding your development, it was about defining who owned you until you were old enough to own yourself.
Chapter 14. Punishment. The rod and the ruler.
And if the law saw you as property, the culture of the time provided the tools for enforcement. The threat of punishment wasn't a distant possibility, it was the daily reality of growing up. The rod and the ruler weren't just symbols of authority. They were the primary teaching tools, endorsed by everyone from your parents to the church itself. Corporal punishment was standard, accepted, and deeply ingrained. The theological justification was pulled straight from the Bible. Spare the rod, spoil the child. This wasn't interpreted as a metaphor. It was a literal instruction. Physical discipline was seen as a moral duty, a necessary process to beat the inherent sinfulness out of a child and shape them into a God-fearing, obedient adult. Disobedience, laziness, even simple mistakes were met with a swift physical response. It was considered for your own good, a painful inoculation against a life of waywardness. This philosophy extended into every institution. In the rare village school, the teacher's ruler was as important as his book, used to rap knuckles for sloppy penmanship or a wrong answer. But for most children, The real classroom was the workshop, and the master's authority was absolute. An apprentice who ruined a piece of leather or who was caught slacking could expect a beating. The contract you signed gave him that right. The punishment was meant to teach a lesson you wouldn't forget, literally branding the correction onto your skin and your memory. The violence was normalized. It wasn't seen as abuse, it was discipline. It was the way things were done. You watched older siblings get hit, you got hit yourself, and you internalized the idea that this was simply how the world worked. There was no concept of trauma. There was no safe space. Your home, your workshop, your community, all were environments where your body was not entirely your own, but an object to be corrected and shaped through pain. The constant, low-grade threat of punishment was just another layer of the harsh reality you had to endure. Another reason your childhood was less about carefree joy and more about learning your place through sheer, unrelenting hardship. It was a humiliation ritual disguised as pedagogy, and it was a universal part of growing up. Chapter 15. The Rural Child's Year. Seasonal Labor Cycles. So you've survived the legal system, you've endured the punishments, and you've learned your place. But your life wasn't a flat line of misery. It was a cycle, a wheel that turned with the seasons, and each turn brought its own unique flavor of hardship. Your entire existence was dictated by the agricultural calendar. There was no summer vacation, no winter break. There was only work, and the type of work changed with the weather. Spring wasn't about flowers and new beginnings, it was about back-breaking planting. As soon as the ground thawed, the entire family was in the fields. Your small hands were perfect for the delicate, tedious work. You'd be tasked with sowing seeds, walking up and down the furrows, scattering precious grains from a pouch. You'd be weeding, bent over for hours, pulling out anything that wasn't the crop. This was also the time for lambing and calving, so you'd be helping with the newborn animals, a constant cycle of feeding and care. The days were getting longer, which just meant more hours of daylight to fill with labor. Spring was a race against time, a frantic push to get the food in the ground that would hopefully feed you all through the next winter. Then came summer, and with it, the longest days of the year. The sun rose early and set late, and you were expected to work every minute of it. This was the season of haymaking, a critical task. Everyone, from the smallest child to the oldest grandparent, was out in the meadows cutting grass with sickles, turning it to dry in the sun and gathering it into stacks. It was hot, dusty, itchy work. The hay was for the livestock to eat during the winter, so the survival of your animals, and by extension your family, depended on this effort. There was no hiding from the sun, no SPF 50. You just baked, your skin tanning and cracking, your small body pushed to its absolute limit under the relentless summer heat. Autumn was the climax, the most intense period of labor in the entire year. The harvest. This was it. Everything you'd done since spring led to this moment. The entire village worked together in a feverish rush to bring in the crops before the autumn rains could ruin them. You'd be right there in the thick of it, using a small sickle to cut the stalks of wheat or rye, gathering sheaves, and helping to transport the grain. It was exhausting, dangerous work with sharp tools swinging all around you. But the pressure was immense. A successful harvest meant you might eat through the winter. A failed one meant hunger, or worse. There was no room for error, no time for rest. You worked until you collapsed, woke up, and did it again. The harvest was a collective trauma and triumph, and you were a vital part of the machine. And then, finally, winter. The world froze, and the pace of life slowed, but it didn't stop. The outdoor agricultural work was over, but now the indoor work began. This was the time for maintenance and domestic crafts.
You'd help your father repair tools in the dim light of the hearth. You'd help your mother with spinning wool or flax, a monotonous task that took hours but produced the thread needed for next year's clothes. You'd help with processing the food that had been harvested, shelling nuts, grinding grain. It was a time of relative rest compared to the harvest frenzy, but it was far from idle. The cold was a constant enemy, and the struggle was to stay warm and productive indoors while the wind howled outside. It was a quieter, darker, more introspective time, but the underlying reality was the same. Your value was your labor, and the cycle would begin again as soon as the first thaw came. Your childhood was not a time of growth and exploration. It was a training ground for a life of endless, seasonal toil. Chapter 16. Specific tasks, from bird scaring to spinning. And within that brutal seasonal cycle, your day was carved up into a series of specific, demanding chores. There was no such thing as an age-inappropriate task. There was only work that your small body could physically manage. From the moment you could walk, you were given a job. Your childhood was a gradual progression from tiny, simple tasks to the full burden of an adult's labor. One of the very first jobs you might be given was bird scaring. It sounds almost quaint, but it was deadly serious. After the seeds were sown in spring, the birds would descend, and they could wipe out a family's entire food supply in a day. So you, at maybe 4 or 5 years old, would be stationed at the edge of the field. Your job was to make noise, to wave your arms, to throw stones, to be a constant, shrieking nuisance from sunrise to sunset. It was lonely, boring, and absolutely critical. The success of the harvest, and therefore your family's survival, could literally depend on how well you could yell at crows. There was no room for a wandering attention span. If you failed, everyone starved. As you grew a little bigger and stronger, the tasks escalated. You'd be responsible for watching the family's geese or sheep, taking them to common grazing land and making sure they didn't wander off or get taken by predators. This was a step up from bird scaring. You were now responsible for living assets. You'd also be the family's primary fetcher. Fetching water was a constant back and forth trek to the village well or the nearest stream, carrying heavy buckets. Gathering firewood was another endless task, scouring the ground for fallen branches to keep the hearth burning. These weren't occasional errands. They were the background rhythm of your day, repeated over and over until your arms ached. Come harvest time, you were fully integrated into the workforce. Even with a small sickle, you could help cut the grain. Your main job was often as a gatherer, following behind the adult reapers, collecting the cut stalks and tying them into sheaves. It was frantic, exhausting work, your small hands struggling with the coarse stalks, the sharp stubble cutting your bare feet, the sun beating down. There was no sitting this one out. The entire community was mobilized, and you were a vital cog in the machine. And the work didn't stop when you came inside. For girls, and for younger boys, the domestic crafts filled every spare moment. The most universal task was spinning. Using a drop spindle, a simple weighted stick, you would spin raw wool or flax into thread. It was a monotonous, hypnotic task that could be done while sitting by the fire or even while watching the animals. It required skill and patience, and you'd start learning as soon as your fingers were nimble enough. A girl might be expected to produce a certain amount of thread each day. Other tasks included helping with cooking, stirring the ever-present pottage, grinding grain with a hand quern, which was hard, repetitive labor. You'd help with brewing ale, with sewing, with mending. There were no idle hands. From the moment you woke up to the moment you collapsed into your shared bed, You were performing a task that contributed, in some small way, to the family's precarious hold on survival. Your play was the brief pause between one chore and the next. Your value was measured not in laughter, but in labor. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for part 2. Sweet dreams, and see you in the next one.